Most people don't feel stuck because they're lazy. They feel stuck because they're confused. Confused about why they're trying so hard, and still feel behind. They save a bit, they cut expenses, they try to be more responsible, and yet nothing feels solid. So they start asking themselves quiet questions they don't like the answers to. Why does this feel harder for me than for everyone else? Why do I keep resetting? Why do I understand what I should do, but can't seem to stay consistent? My name is Zack, and for a long time, I thought that feeling meant I was failing. I thought being behind meant I was doing something wrong, that I was late, unprepared, bad with money. But here's the truth most people never hear. Feeling behind is often a sign that you're becoming aware, not that you're failing. And awareness is uncomfortable because awareness shows you gaps before it shows you progress. It shows you risk before it shows you safety. It shows you responsibility before it shows you reward. At the beginning, you don't feel ahead. You feel exposed. You notice how thin your margin really is, how fragile things actually are, how much of your life was held together by momentum and hope. Before you weren't calm, you were distracted. Before you weren't safe, you just weren't looking. And once you start looking, your brain doesn't reward you for it. It punishes you with anxiety. That's why early progress feels so strange. You're doing better on paper, but worse emotionally. And that disconnect is what makes people quit. They don't quit because they don't care. They quit because caring suddenly costs something. This video is about that moment, the moment where you're technically improving, but mentally struggling, and why that phase, as uncomfortable as it feels, is not a detour. It's the doorway. That uncomfortable feeling doesn't show up randomly. It shows up at a very specific point, right when you stop living on autopilot. Before that, money problems are noisy, but familiar. You're stressed, but you know the script. Spend, worry, react, repeat. Once you start paying attention, the noise changes. Now the stress isn't loud, it's sharp. You notice patterns you ignored before, small leaks, bad habits, decisions that don't seem dramatic, but add up quietly. And suddenly, everything feels heavier. Not because your situation got worse, but because your brain removed the filters. This is where most people misinterpret what's happening. They assume the stress means they're not cut out for this, that money stuff just isn't for them, that other people must have more discipline, more confidence, more natural ability. But what they're actually experiencing is cognitive load. When you were broke and unaware, your brain could avoid responsibility. Now that you're aware, it can't. Every choice feels meaningful, every mistake feels amplified, every delay feels dangerous. And your brain hates that. So it looks for relief, not long term relief, immediate relief. That's why people sabotage themselves right here. They stop tracking, they stop checking, they loosen standards, they tell themselves they'll get back to it later. From the outside, it looks like self sabotage. From the inside, it feels like survival, because the brain under pressure doesn't optimize for growth, it optimizes for comfort. This is why advice like, just stay consistent, feels insulting at this stage. Consistency assumes emotional stability, and emotional stability hasn't arrived yet. You're trying to build habits while your nervous system is still in defense mode. That's not a character flaw, that's timing, and timing matters more than effort. The mistake isn't that people quit. The mistake is that no one tells them what this phase actually is. It's not the point where you're supposed to feel good. It's the point where you're learning how exposed you really are. And that awareness, as unpleasant as it feels, is the price of building something real. Here's the part that almost nobody explains clearly. Early financial progress doesn't reduce pressure, it reorganizes it. Before, your stress was chaotic. Everything felt urgent, everything felt dangerous, but it was also vague. Now the pressure has a shape. You know exactly how little margin you have. You know how fragile things still are. You know one mistake could undo weeks of effort. And paradoxically, that knowledge can feel worse than ignorance. This is why people say things like, I was happier when I wasn't tracking. They weren't happier. They were just numb. Awareness without safety creates tension. Your brain sees responsibility before it sees protection. And until protection shows up, that responsibility feels threatening. This is why willpower alone never works here. You're asking your brain to stay calm while it still believes you're exposed. That's an impossible ask. So instead of building momentum, people start negotiating with themselves. I'll save, but not this month. I'll be disciplined, but after this expense. I'll get serious once things feel easier. But easier never arrives on its own, because ease isn't the cause of progress, it's the result of staying through discomfort long enough. This is where many people misunderstand the role of discipline. They think discipline is pushing harder. It isn't. Discipline at this stage is not quitting when the feedback is delayed, it's staying while nothing feels rewarding yet, while no one is clapping, while your life looks exactly the same on the surface. That's why this phase filters people out. Not because it's hard, but because it's emotionally quiet, no dopamine, no validation, no visible payoff, just restraint. And restraint without context feels like punishment, but restraint with context becomes strategy. Once you understand that this phase is supposed to feel flat, not broken, something changes. You stop fighting the feeling, you stop taking it personally, you stop assuming discomfort means failure, and that shift doesn't remove the pressure, but it keeps you in the game long enough for the next phase to arrive. There's a moment that quietly changes everything, and most people don't notice it when it happens. It's not when you hit a round number, it's not when your balance looks impressive, it's not when life suddenly feels easy. It's the first time something goes wrong and you don't spiral. An unexpected bill, a repair, a delay, a problem that used to trigger panic. And instead of freezing or borrowing or mentally collapsing, you handle it. Not happily, not casually, but calmly enough. You pay it, you adjust, you move on, and in that moment, your brain learns something new. This didn't break me. That lesson matters more than any spreadsheet or strategy, because until your brain experiences safety in real time, it doesn't trust theory. You can read about emergency funds all day, you can understand the math perfectly, but belief only locks in when fear fails to appear. This is why early progress feels invisible. You're building protection for problems that haven't happened yet, and the human brain is terrible at valuing protection. We notice pain, we don't notice pain avoided. So weeks go by, months go by, and your brain keeps saying nothing's changing. But something is. Your baseline stress starts to drop quietly. You breathe a little deeper. You sleep a little better. You don't feel that constant urgency to fix everything immediately. That's not discipline. That's relief. And relief unlocks behaviors force never could. You stop reacting to every expense. You stop treating every decision like an emergency. You start giving yourself time to think, time to wait, time to choose slower, better options. From the outside, this looks like discipline finally appeared. But discipline didn't arrive, safety did. And once safety exists, even in small amounts, patience becomes possible. This is where long term thinking finally has room to breathe. Not because you're optimistic, but because you're no longer afraid of one bad week undoing everything. That's the real shift. And once it starts, it tends to compound quietly. There's one final shift that almost nobody talks about because it doesn't feel like a financial milestone, it feels personal. Once stability sticks, not for days, not for weeks, but long enough, your relationship with yourself begins to change. You stop seeing life as something that's constantly about to go wrong. You stop scanning every situation for risk. You stop making decisions as if one mistake will ruin everything, and that's where the biggest transformation happens. Not in your bank account, in your identity. Before stability, your internal story sounds like this: I'm bad with money. I always mess this up. I can't be trusted with long term plans. Every setback reinforces that story. But after stability, something strange happens. Reality stops supporting it. You handle a problem without panicking. You say no without guilt. You wait instead of reacting. Nothing dramatic changes on the surface, but internally, something clicks. You start trusting yourself, and trust is the real upgrade. This is why people who reach this stage often seem calmer, even before they're wealthy. They're not calmer because they have more money. They're calmer because they're no longer afraid of themselves. They know they won't self destruct at the first sign of discomfort. They know they can sit with boredom, with waiting, with uncertainty. That changes everything. How you approach work, how you negotiate, how you plan, how you take risks. You stop chasing short term relief. You stop optimizing for comfort. You start optimizing for direction. And direction compounds faster than motivation ever could. This is also why advice starts to feel different at this stage. Before, advice felt overwhelming, contradictory, impossible to apply. Now, you don't need most of it. You can feel when something adds pressure. You can feel when something aligns. You can feel when something quietly steals your future. That intuition didn't come from intelligence, it came from stability. Money doesn't just change what you can buy, it changes how you experience time. When you're under pressure, time feels short, urgent, threatening. When you're stable, time opens up. You can wait, you can plan, you can think in years instead of weeks. And that alone puts you ahead of most people, not because you're smarter, not because you're more disciplined, but because you're no longer trapped in survival mode. That's why boring progress wins, not because it's exciting, but because it works. And once you understand that, everything else becomes possible.